Officially known as the German Reich, Nazi Germany was the German state between 1933 and 1945, when it was headed by Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party, who governed by way of a totalitarian dictatorship. The term Third Reich means Third Realm or Third Empire, and refers to the Nazi declaration that Nazi Germany was the successor to both the Holy Roman Empire and the German Empire, the latter of which took place between 1871 and 1918, ending with the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II. In Nazi Germany, life was difficult. Though there was little unemployment, workers were subject to poor wages and bad conditions. Women were to stay at home and produce children, while children themselves were indoctrinated with political propaganda as soon as they entered education. And of course, many who didn't fit the so-called norms of society, whether it was due to their sexuality, religion, ethnicity, race, disabilities, or unwillingness to fight in the war, were punished and persecuted. Join us for this documentary as we explore the rise and fall of the Third Reich of Germany. Welcome to Wars of the World. In late 1919, Adolf Hitler joined the DAP, or the German Workers' Party, a far-right political party established following the end of World War I. Though the party lasted just over a year, it was an important stepping stone for Hitler in his search for power. He became a prominent figurehead within the party, and even became its leader after threatening to leave. Nobody was keen to see him go, as he was one of the party's most popular speakers, and he drew attention and support to the party. The following year, the group shed its old name and became known as the NSDAP, or the National Socialist German Workers' Party, though today it is simply referred to as the Nazi Party. Though Hitler didn't approve of the inclusion of the term socialist, as it didn't align with his politics, it was chosen to entice left-wing and working-class citizens. The party initially boasted policies and ideologies that fall in line with anti-capitalist and anti-bourgeois rhetoric, but it was generally considered a right-wing party, and later, those more left-wing elements would be removed from the party's doctrine and replaced by pro-business and wealth protection components. For several years, Hitler remained the leader of the Nazi Party, but in 1922 he was thrust into the national spotlight when he stood trial for carrying out a botched coup in Bavaria. And though he was given 5 years in prison for the offence, he served just 9 months before being released. It was around this time that he penned the now infamous Mein Kampf, known in English as My Struggle, his autobiographical manifesto, which served as the basis of many Nazi Party policies. Hitler seized the opportunity upon leaving prison to begin campaigning, making use of his newly gathered fame. He and his Nazi party advocated for anti-communism, anti-Semitism, ultranationalism, and the total destruction of the Treaty of Versailles, signed at the end of World War I. Though he was relentless in his campaigning, at the time not much attention was paid to Hitler and his Nazi party. It wasn't until the 1929 Wall Street crash in the US that the German economy and its people were thrown into crisis. Leveraging the difficult times that civilians in Germany were facing, Hitler began to disavow the current government loudly and criticized its lack of help and concern for its people. It was around this time the left-wing Communist Party of Germany, or KPD, began to rise, calling for a revolution, and because many citizens were fearful of communism, they opted to support the Nazi Party instead. Though Hitler ran for the presidency in 1932, he lost to Paul von Hindenburg. Still, he maintained a strong support base, having come in second place, and in the following months, the Nazi Party grew to become the largest party in the Reichstag, the lower house of Germany's parliament. The following year, in January 1933, Hitler was appointed as Germany's new Chancellor, and in the subsequent months, he set to work attempting to gather as much power as he possibly could. Less than a month after being appointed as Chancellor, the Reichstag was set ablaze. Hitler alleged that communists were responsible for the fire, and pressured von Hindenburg to pass the Reichstag Fire Decree, which curtailed many civil liberties that the German people had previously enjoyed. As well as limiting civilian freedoms, such as protesting, freedom of expression and the press, and secrecy of correspondence, a written guideline along with the decree, meaning that it was up to the government to interpret and implement the rules as they saw fit. It allowed the government to assume powers previously reserved for federal states, and saw them introduce harsh penalties for specific crimes, including the death penalty for setting fire to public buildings. The decree naturally wreaked havoc on the KPD. In parts of Germany, the communist press was banned, as were communist meetings and demonstrations. They even apprehended party leaders. Meanwhile, in Prussia, arrests of KPD members were common, with thousands of leaders being imprisoned just days after the fire. In the 2 weeks following the release of the Reichstag Fire Decree, the total number of arrests in Prussia was 10,000. In the aftermath of the introduction of the decree, Hitler started removing anyone he deemed to be a threat to his political career, and pushed for harsher measures to be implemented when it came to dispatching his rivals. And thus came the Enabling Act of 1933, a law which gave the German cabinet, and specifically the Chancellor, the power to make and enforce laws without them needing to be approved and overseen by either the Reichstag or President von Hindenburg. It effectively allowed Hitler to avoid the checks and balances which were designed to prevent a prominent politician such as himself from abusing his power. The following month, in April 1933, Hitler constructed the first concentration camp in Dachau. It was first intended to be used for his political opponents, including communists and social democrats, although later criminals, foreign invaders, and Jews were all sent to the camp. Later that same month, the law for the restoration of the professional civil services was passed. This act is considered one of the earliest examples of the severely racist and anti-Semitic legislation that the Nazi Party was famous for, and sought to remove Jewish and non-Aryan individuals from civil service roles. Many were forced to retire from their positions, but some, mostly those with communist ties, were fired altogether. Non-Aryans were not allowed to hold positions as teachers, judges, lawyers, doctors, professors, or any roles within the government. In May, union offices were demolished, union leaders were arrested, and trade union groups were forced to dissolve. In the months that followed, Hitler did all he could to dissuade and disband his political opponents, much of which he did by force. In May, he ordered the seizure of the assets of the Social Democrats to report to him and follow the general policies that he'd set out. He also expected them to take their own initiatives when dealing with situations and make decisions that would help him in his goals for Germany. Possibly in order to avoid uprisings, he often pit his leaders against one another and fostered a work environment of distrust and infighting, giving contradictory orders to subordinates and having their work overlap, which would often lead to conflicts among them. In 1934, Hitler introduced the law concerning the head of state together with that of the Reich president, meaning that he had the powers of both. It also meant that the only person who could dismiss Hitler from his position was Hitler himself. Shortly after Hitler's takeover, civil servants as well as members of the military were forced to swear unconditional loyalty and obedience not to their country but to the Führer. He positioned himself in such a way that his word was deemed to be more important than the law. For example, any acts that he had sanctioned, including murder, were legal, even though murder was still considered a crime otherwise. Many laws remained in place following his takeover, though courts began to issue more death sentences than they had previously. Those convicted of multiple offences, even if they were minor, could see themselves put in prison for the rest of their lives, and thousands of petty offenders, like thieves and sex workers, were imprisoned without a trial. Hitler established the People's Court in 1934 after he became disgruntled by the outcome of the Leipzig trial. In July 1933, 5 people were charged with committing the Reichstag fire in February, and the Leipzig trial, which took place between September and December that year, was held at the Reich Supreme Court. On December 23rd, it was declared that although the judges believed there was a communist conspiracy to burn down the Reichstag, there was insufficient evidence to connect 4 out of the 5 accused to the arson attack. As a result, only the Dutch national Marinus van der Lubbe was convicted of the crime and sentenced to death. He was executed on January 10, 1934. The People's Court was given a whole host of crimes to deal with, including but not limited to defeatism, treason, and black marketeering, but often it tackled even pettier issues like poking fun at the Führer or existing as a communist. Crimes such as the former were referred to as the disintegration of defensive capability, and thus those accused were heavily penalized and sentenced to death. The court was known to conclude trial quickly, often without evidence or arguments being presented on either side, while the president of the court, Roland Freisler, acted as the prosecutor. He never received pushback from the defense, and rarely, if ever, sided with them. He ignored proper procedure and standards of law and justice, and many refer to it today as a kangaroo court. All lawyers under the Nazi regime were forced to join the Nazis Lawyers Association, meaning they could be controlled. And these changes in the judicial system meant that crime rates went down, while the number of crimes which carried the death penalty went from just 3 to 46. Even those who were released from prison were often not free to go home. They were instead moved to concentration camps. Reinforcing the decisions made by the court and assisting in investigating supposed crimes was the Gestapo, Germany's secret police force, which was created by Hermann Göring, one of the Nazi Party's most prominent and powerful figures, in 1933. The Gestapo was one of Hitler's most brutal and violent units, known to have committed widespread horrors and atrocities during its existence. The Gestapo often targeted political opponents, dissenters, criminals, as well as those who didn't fit into societal norms, like homosexuals and the disabled, as well as Romani and Jewish people. Those apprehended by the Gestapo were often subjected to abuse and placed in concentration camps without due process, and the unit was known to survey the German population while looking for such people, although the fear they instilled in the German people often promoted citizens to report on one another. Student and youth opposition groups like the White Rose, Edelweiss Pirates, and the Swing Youth were all placed under Gestapo observation, and eventually many of their members and leaders were arrested and sentenced to death or sent to live in concentration camps. During the mid to late 1930s, the Gestapo infiltrated many resistance groups and placed its members in concentration camps as a form of protective detention, as there was no legal defense for such a thing. As well as instilling fear into its people, the Nazi Party worked hard to spread its hatred and bigotry through propaganda and laws. As we well know, racism and anti-Semitism were basic pillars of the party's dogma, with the Nazis believing that the superior master race was the Aryan race, effectively white German people whose roots could be traced back to 18th or 19th century Europe. Those who didn't fit this standard, including Jewish, black, and Romani people, were not considered to be of the so-called Aryan race, as they were considered by Nazis to be non-European. Nazis believed that inferior races had infiltrated society and were responsible for the exploitation and repression of the Aryan race. In September 1935, the Nuremberg laws were enacted, prohibiting physical and romantic relationships, including marriage, between Aryans and Jews, although the laws were later expanded to include anyone who was considered non-Aryan, including black and Romani people. The laws also stated that women under the age of 45 could not be employed by Jewish households, while another law, the Reich citizenship law, observed that only those of German or related blood could be citizens. To prove citizenship, Germans were forced to go through a lengthy process of tracing their ancestry back to the 19th century, with many hiring genealogists to look through official records and acquire the necessary paperwork. Once completed, relevant paperwork was submitted to the Reich office for kinship research for review. Furthermore, citizenship could be revoked or denied to anyone who was not supportive enough of the Nazi regime. Though those considered non-Aryan were persecuted, it was often Jewish families, individuals and businesses that suffered the most under Hitler's dictatorship, and his attacks against the Jewish community were virtually instantaneous following the Reichstag Fire Decree and the Enabling Act of 1933. In March of that year, the SA attacked various Jewish businesses and synagogues, and a month later, on April 1st, Hitler declared a national boycott of Jewish businesses. Such businesses were not allowed to advertise and were not given access to government contracts, while German towns began posting signs stating that Jews were not allowed to enter. As previously mentioned, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service passed later that same month, and similar legislation came into effect shortly afterwards, which forced Jewish people out of even more professional roles. Those with even one Jewish parent or grandparent were considered non-Aryan and were pressured to leave the country voluntarily. In 1938, things escalated sharply when, on November 7th, Herschel Greenspan, a Jewish teenager, shot and killed a Nazi Party member and Foreign Office diplomat named Ernst von Rath. Herschel and his family had, like many Jewish families, faced great difficulties in the previous years since Hitler seized power. His father lost his business, his siblings lost their jobs, and by the time of the murder in 1938, he just learnt that his parents had been forcibly removed from their home and sent to Sponschen, a concentration camp on the border with Poland. Following the murder, the Nazis instigated a riot, where the SA damaged and destroyed synagogues, schools, homes and other Jewish properties throughout the country. While at least 91 German Jews were murdered, it is estimated that over 600 Jewish individuals took their own lives afterwards. This nightmarish episode was later called the Night of Broken Glass, or Kristallnacht, deriving its name from the fact that the following day, shattered glass littered the roads and pavements due to the extensive damage done to the buildings. The SA were helped by civilians, as well as members of Hitler's youth, and ultimately about 267 synagogues were destroyed, over 7,000 businesses were ruined, and about 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Of the atrocity, British newspaper The Times wrote on November 11th, quote, "No foreign propagandist bent upon blackening Germany before the world could outdo the tale of burnings and beatings, of blackguardly assaults on defenseless and innocent people, which disgraced that country yesterday." End quote. In the following months, Jews became prisoners, even if they weren't already in concentration camps. They were forbidden from driving cars, working, owning businesses, visiting the cinema or library, owning weapons, and from attending school. The Jewish community as a whole was fined 1 billion marks to pay for the damage and ordered to hand over any insurance payouts that they received from damages to their property. By 1939, around 250,000 of the 437,000 Jews living in Germany had left the country. Yet another horrifying program introduced by the Nazi regime was Action T4, which campaigned to euthanize the disabled. Specially selected doctors were brought in to choose patients who were deemed incurably sick after most critical medical examination, and then kill the patients by giving them a mercy death. Between September 1939 and September 1945, between 275,000 and 300,000 people were killed in psychiatric hospitals in Germany, Austria, occupied Poland, and what was then known as the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, modern-day Czechia. Around half of the individuals killed had been taken from church-run asylums, usually with approval from the institution's authorities. Prior to the beginning of Action T4, around 400,000 people were forcibly sterilized following the law for the prevention of genetically diseased offspring, which was enacted on July 14th, 1933. Half of this 400,000 were deemed to be mentally deficient, but others were seen to be unclean or have deviant behavior of some sort. Sex workers, the unhoused, criminals, and even those living in poverty were all deemed to be undesirable to the Nazi regime, and so they were prevented from ever having children. Many German citizens had supported the Nazis in the very beginning due to their promises of making a brighter, wealthier future for a whole country of people, whose economy had been devastated by the Wall Street crash of 1929. Hitler himself sought to minimize unemployment and was keen to establish Germany as a self-sufficient country. And by 1939, he'd achieved one of those things. There was very little unemployment in the country at this time. He helped to improve employment rates by building hospitals, schools, and other public buildings, such as the 1936 Olympic Stadium, while the construction of motorways employed over 80,000 men. Similarly, he began rebuilding Germany's military, despite the fact that it was in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, which created millions of jobs. In 1934, he told his military leaders that rearmament would need to be completed by 1942. This was because, as part of his foreign policy, Hitler wished to achieve Lebensraum, the term used to describe his desire for the German people to acquire more living space by forcibly taking territory from the east. The concept of Lebensraum was based on Hitler's racist beliefs and ideologies, including the supposed superiority of the Aryan race. In 1935, he announced the creation of the Air Force and added that over 500,000 men were being added to the German armed forces. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement later that year allowed Germany to begin building its own naval fleet. Furthermore, as Hitler was a firm believer that women were to be homemakers and childbearers, he made sure that men were in steady employment that could support growing families. He introduced the National Labour Service for men between the ages of 18 and 25, which saw them help build the previously mentioned public buildings and roads, and he also had young men conscripted into the army. Though unemployment rates were incredibly low during Hitler's time in power, it's worth noting that these statistics don't include various groups, such as Jews who were made unemployed and moved to concentration camps, women who were forced to give up their jobs to stay at home, and men who were part of the military. While those working in the armament industries did well under the Nazi regime, with managers seeing a 50% wage increase, those outside of such industries struggled. Wages fell, working hours increased, the number of serious accidents at workplaces increased, and employees ran the risk of being blacklisted if they attempted to either unionize or simply ask for better wages or working conditions. Women under the Nazi regime were seen as little more than baby-making machines, as Hitler wanted to increase the Aryan population. At one point, he even allowed women to volunteer to have a baby for a member of the SS. To help incentivize women to settle down and to increase the chances of couples having children, he introduced the law of the encouragement of marriage, which allowed newlyweds to receive a loan of 1,000 marks and to keep 250 marks for each child that they had. Mothers who had large numbers of children were awarded with the Mother's Cross, while women as a whole were heavily discouraged from working, and eventually the law for the reduction of unemployment was introduced, financially incentivizing women to stay at home. Women were not drafted into the army until 1943, 2 years before the end of the war. Notably, not even young girls were able to escape the traditional gender role indoctrination, as while boys had the Hitler Youth program, which taught them how to stay fit and fire a rifle, young girls had the League of German Girls, which taught them how to cook and sew. Both girls and boys, however, were taught an altered curriculum at school, which focused on indoctrinating them with Nazi beliefs. Their history lessons included how the party rose to prominence, while biology involved learning about eugenics and pseudoscience. Children were even taught a new subject, race study and ideology, which focused on Aryan ideals with a side of anti-Semitism. Hitler and the Nazis sought to control every aspect of German citizens' lives, and propaganda and the censoring of journalism was a huge part of that. Joseph Goebbels headed the government department responsible for such activities, the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. As well as making the Nazis and Hitler a part of everyday life by having the Nazi flags displayed throughout the country, along with photos of the Führer, Goebbels made sure that all media outlets were controlled by the party, restricting what stories they could print. More often than not, only ones that showed Hitler and the Nazis in a favourable light. Similarly, the Reich Broadcasting Corporation was the only accessible radio station at the time, run of course by Goebbels. As well as that, the Nazis held regular rallies for the public to show their support, while the 1936 Olympics was used to display the supposed superiority of the Aryan race. Loudspeakers in the streets were used to deliver messages supportive of the regime, and Nazi control was so tight that it even extended to art and culture. Modern art was considered degenerate by Hitler, and so over 6,500 works were removed from public display, while films shown in Germany were only done if they served the purpose of being useful propaganda. Eventually, the Nazis took over film production and distribution, with the party founding a professional school for politically reliable filmmakers. Classical music by Jewish composers was banned, but the works of German composers was heavily promoted. Jazz music was also considered a massive no-go by the Nazis, and the regime was very strict about which books were allowed to be obtained and viewed by the public. In 1933, they burned thousands of books that were considered to represent ideologies that didn't line up with those of the Nazis, including those written by pacifists, anarchists, socialists, sexologists, communists, and Jewish individuals. These book burnings allowed an attack on the Institute for Sexual Science, a non-profit foundation based in Berlin, which was the first sexology research center in the world and was headed by Magnus Hirschfeld. These book burnings included Magnus's work and the archives of the institute. In May of 1933, Hitler stated that he would accept an offer from US President Franklin D. Roosevelt for military disarmament, but only on the condition that the rest of Europe did the same thing. When they failed to do this essentially impossible task, Hitler pulled Germany out of the World Disarmament Conference and the League of Nations. He stated that the disarmament proposals were unfair as they only applied to Germany. He often spoke of longing for world peace and even signed a non-aggression pact with Poland in January of 1934, using it to support his claims that he had no interest in war. Furthermore, when a Nazi uprising began in Austria later that year, but ultimately failed, he disavowed the plan and sent his men to Vienna to repair relations. During the late 1930s, Hitler was kept very busy with his various relations with other countries. In the months following the signing of the Anglo-German Naval Agreement in June 1935, the Second Italo-Ethiopian War broke out, in which Nazi Germany supplied arms and supplies to Ethiopia. Germany supported Ethiopia over Italy due to Italy's repeated rejections of Germany's desire to annex Austria. The war was strenuous on Italy, and ultimately led the country to rely economically on Germany. Furthermore, Italy began to intervene less in Hitler's plans for Austria. The outbreak of the Spanish Civil War in 1936 also allowed Hitler to establish better relations with Benito Mussolini, Italy's dictator, and in October of that year, the two countries formed a coalition named the Rome-Berlin Axis. He also used the Spanish Civil War to double down on his anti-communist campaign, and in 1937, Germany, Italy, and Japan all entered into the Anti-Comintern Pact, an anti-communist agreement that the Japanese believed would be an alliance against the Soviet Union. But in 1940, the three countries signed the Berlin Pact, which identified the US as the main threat, rather than the Soviets. Over the years, Nazi Germany had sought to annex Austria and force them to fall under Germany's rule, but it wasn't until 1938 that the Nazis achieved such a feat. Early that year, Austrian Chancellor Kurt von Schuschnigg met with Hitler in a bid to reassert the country's independence. But the meeting didn't go as planned, and on March 9th, he called for a vote to determine whether or not Austria's people wished for the country to be annexed. However, before the vote could take place, von Schuschnigg buckled under the pressure placed against him by the Nazi Party and ultimately resigned. Reportedly, while under coercion from the Nazis and as a part of his resignation speech, he asked Austrian forces to comply with a German advance into the country. The next day, on March 12th, Hitler and his men entered the country, where they were met with admiration and enthusiasm. The annexation of Austria was completed on March 13th, after a new Nazi government was appointed. Von Schuschnigg, for his part, was imprisoned following his resignation. The following year, Germany invaded Czechoslovakia, and on September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, though he was told that if Germany did not leave, Britain and France would declare war. Hitler's men ultimately remained, and the invasion continued. 2 days later, Britain declared war. On April 29, 1945, members of the US military entered Dachau, the longest-running concentration camp, shocked to find thousands of emaciated prisoners who'd been left behind. By the time the camp was liberated, Italy had fallen and things were looking bleak for Hitler and the Nazis. Defeat was inevitable. The following day, Hitler took his own life in the underground bunker he'd been holed up inside in Berlin. In the 2 years before Hitler's death and the end of the war, it was clear that Nazi Germany would crumble beneath the force of the Allied powers. His own men had attempted to remove him from power so that they could negotiate a better deal for themselves. But botched assassination attempts only led the Führer to double down, leading him to execute over 4,000 of his own men. Even after the fall of Hitler and Nazi Germany, fighting continued in Japan. It wouldn't be until September 2nd that US General Douglas MacArthur accepted the country's formal surrender. World War II ended after 6 grueling years and cost the lives of between 60 and 80 million people, around 3% of the total world's population, an unprecedented number. The vast majority of these deaths were those of civilians, many of whom died in concentration camps, including the 6 million Jews murdered during the Holocaust. 27 million deaths had also been caused in the Soviet Union alone. Many German citizens were deeply, emotionally, and psychologically scarred in the aftermath of the war. Hitler had promised them wealth and power, but much of the country had been reduced to nothing but rubble, and widespread famine followed shortly afterwards. As well as the destruction of much of the country, Germany also lost around a quarter of its pre-war territory, including the regions of Pomerania and East Prussia, the latter of which was split between the Soviet Union and Poland, and 9 million people were displaced following the systematic expulsion of Germans from these areas. The Allied powers began organizing war crime trials in the months following the end of the war, the first of which to take place was the Nuremberg trials, held between November 1945 and October 1946. These trials aimed to hold prominent Nazis accountable for the atrocities that they'd committed during the conflict, with the International Military Tribunal overseeing and trying 22 of the surviving party leaders, as well as 6 German organizations. The defendants included notable Nazi figures such as Hermann Göring, head of the Gestapo and Hitler's right-hand man for a time, Rudolf Hess, who'd once been Hitler's deputy Führer until 1941 when he flew to the UK and attempted to broker peace with the British government, and Hans Fritzsche, the head of the news division of the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. All but 3 of the men charged were found guilty, and 12 were sentenced to death. Further Nuremberg trials were held between 1946 and 1949, which featured 489 cases of the 3,887 investigated by the Allies. The resulting trials saw the convictions of over 1,400 Nazis, 297 of which were sentenced to death. Around 65% of these death sentences were carried out. Poland was also active in persecuting German officials for war crimes, and ultimately they prosecuted 673 of the 789 staff members working at Auschwitz. Although great attempts were made to hold Nazi officials accountable, there were many prominent figures who escaped justice. Adolf Eichmann was considered at one point the world's most wanted Nazi due to his huge contributions to Hitler's final solution, the last stage of the overall Holocaust. Eichmann helped greatly in identifying Jews and transporting them to Auschwitz, as well as other concentration camps. In 1960, Eichmann was captured by Israeli Mossad agents and found guilty after a 4-month trial. He was sentenced to death and was hanged on May 31st, 1962. Josef Mengele, horrifically dubbed the Angel of Death, was another important Nazi figure who eventually fled Germany. He was known to conduct nightmarish experiments on his patients at Auschwitz, often using women, twins, children, and those with disabilities as human guinea pigs. He hid in Germany for 3 years before eventually making his way to Argentina, where he remarried and owned a mechanical equipment shop. He went underground after Eichmann was captured, and a West German extradition request was sent out to Argentinian authorities, who stated that a review was necessary, effectively blocking the extradition. Though Nazi hunters continued to pursue him, he died in 1979 in Brazil, though his death wasn't verified until 6 years later in 1985. About 10% of the German population was, at one point or another, a member of the Nazi Party or a Nazi-adjacent group, such as the German Labour Front, which had 25 million members, or the National Socialist People's Welfare Organization, which had 17 million members. Following the collapse of the Third Reich, Allied powers set up the Denazification Initiative in an attempt to rid both German and Austrian societies of Nazi ideology. As well as apprehending and charging Nazi party leaders and officials, members of the SS were also held accountable and removed from positions of power. Though the initial project was to be aided by Allied forces, they ultimately relinquished power to Germany in the late 1940s, and by 1951 the initiative had been abolished. Enthusiasm had been high at the start of the program, as was the desire to be thorough. But Nazism had permeated German society so deeply that it was an impossible task to investigate millions of individuals, determine what activities they'd participated in, and hold them legally responsible. Though commitment to the program soon wore thin, the Allies did achieve some level of denazification, such as purging Nazi publications from German libraries, banning the swastika symbol, other Nazi emblems, and the Nazi Party itself, and asking German citizens to fill out questionnaires about their involvement in Nazism. Former Nazis, including civilian supporters, were even taken to concentration camps, mass graves, or forced to watch video clips about the horrific conditions endured by the prisoners. Printed posters of dead bodies were handed out in the summer of 1945, reading, "These atrocities, your fault," or "You are guilty of this." Another reason that the Denazification Initiative was scaled back was due to the looming Cold War, in which the US, as well as Britain, believed that West Germany could be a key ally, and they did not wish to offend the population. Reportedly, this allowed some former Nazi Party figures to continue in positions of power, particularly in West Germany, where the process of denazification was heavily disliked. It was appreciated much more in East Germany, however, where it was considered a key part of helping society shift to a more socialist and left-leaning perspective. Modern US critics of the program called it a counterproductive witch hunt and an overall failure. Following the end of denazification, several amnesty laws were passed, which affected over 790,000 people. Those with light, lesser sentences, including members of the SA, SS, and lower members of the Nazi Party, were ultimately pardoned. As a result of these concessions, many former Nazi Party members entered back into the political system. In 1957, 77% of the German Ministry of Justice's senior officials were all ex-Nazis. In the aftermath of the war, however, expressing Nazi support, sympathies, or beliefs was frowned upon, and those who expressed such sentiments found themselves losing their jobs and being ostracized from society. Many German civilians felt a sense of communal guilt, even if they did not directly participate in the war or the Nazis' many atrocities. For over a decade, Adolf Hitler had espoused his hateful rhetoric and assured the German people that the Third Reich would last 1,000 years. Instead of this happening, it folded and fell in just a mere fraction of that time.